Recorded live.
Welcome to the Virtualization Security Podcast, episode number 66, I believe. And today's panelists are Eben Rodriguez, who consults with enterprises to assist them secure and operate their virtual environments. Michael Berman is the CTO of Catbird, the pioneer and industry leader in security and compliance for virtual environments. Hema Chandra, who's the CTO of HITRUST, also joins us but is unable to make it this week, and we wish her well. It is myself, Edward Haletke, a.k.a. TechSciWill in the VMware Communities Forum and author of the book VMware vSphere and Virtual Infrastructure Security, Securing the Virtual Environment, which is available on Amazon. The podcasts are equalized by Tim Pearson, a contributing author to the same book and owner of Data Century, Inc. Our special guest panelist this week is Rich Miller, who is the CEO of Telematica. Hopefully I got that right.
That's correct.
A consultancy and holding company with emphasis on product strategy and virtualizing the data center, cloud-oriented application platforms, delivery of big data to new markets. Well, welcome, panelists.
Thank you. Thank you.
Today's topic is a little bit different than ones we've done in the past. We're actually talking about following the data. Now, Rich, that's your area, so why don't you tell us what you mean by that?
Thanks very much, Ed. Well, what I've encountered in particular over the last few years as I've worked with a number of companies, both on the product side and consumer side of virtualization, is this notion of mobility. And, why do you move a VM? Why do you move an application? What do you move? And among the various reasons we've all heard are, the follow the sun in order to get the best or performance, or follow the moon in order to go where the resource cost is lowest. Sometimes you move things in order to just get the hell out of Dodge, get out of the way, something bad's coming, and what we're really talking about there is business continuity. But one reason that now continues to come back is I move in order to follow the data. And that means moving processing to the data as opposed to the reverse, which is kind of the usual thought process we go through. And in thinking about moving processing to the data, there seem to be 3 or 4 reasons that I continue to hear for companies, for developers, for architects to be asking about moving the processing or moving the workload being predominantly processed to where data resides. One of the kind of obvious ones is the use of big data. When the size of the data is so extensive that moving it about in a wide area or even across, a data center boundary for something nearby is so enormous that the time and cost involved just doesn't make sense. Well, that's the point in time when you want to move your processing to the data. And that's kind of the easy one.
So let's hold on a second there, Rich. We're talking about when we start talking about follow the data. So we're talking about moving the virtualization workloads around based on follow the sun or follow the moon, and we're also talking about moving the processing closer to the data,
right?
As well as sometimes moving the data closer to the processing, depending on how much data we're talking about. So, given all those mechanisms, what's the security implications of doing this?
Well, there are security implications, but there first order are compliance implications. As unfortunate as it is for a lot of us, the rules and regulations under which we operate in the data centers, a lot of it comes from historical basis, and there are rules about data residency. You're not allowed to leave. The data is not allowed to leave the building. I need to know where the data of a particular kind is at all times, and in order to meet compliance, I have to do that. the implications really are very often a matter of whether it's true or not. Somehow, if I know where the data is and I have access to it and reasonable visibility into its controls, I can keep it safer. So, as you've pointed out, every time you move process and data somewhere else, there's going to be a security implication. But this whole notion of compliance and data residency has been kind of continuing to come up. And what I have heard from a variety of sources is, how do I move the proper amount of processing to the data, and in a situation where I can be assured the data is being cared for and governed in a way that allows my CFO to sleep at night.
But is it really the CFO? It's more the CISO that would have to sleep at night, wouldn't you think?
Well, the
Or
CISO
both.
certainly. The CISO gets, the CISO has got got a lot of responsibility. The CFO is the guy that, at the end of the day, is going to be making the payments when compliance is not met, when you don't meet an audit requirement. So I think they're both having their sleepless nights.
Okay. So if I'm moving the processing to the data, let's say it's a big data issue, and I have something like an Isilon where I can move virtual workloads to the data.
Mm-hmm.
What are the security implications? I mean, I'm going to open this up. Michael, you guys probably deal with something similar to this. How do you get? What's the big issue with this when you have to follow the data?
Well, I don't know. I was just going to say, you almost always, in a sense, have to follow the data because security should be data-centric, or to some lesser degree system-centric, assuming that you understand which systems are doing the data processing, which is an interesting point being brought up here by Rich. So, usually for us, one of the questions that comes up is, do you understand the boundaries for both where the data is stored and the systems processing the data and the users accessing the data? And that's often something we have to help our customers figure out. And with the cloud and virtualization, of course, that's gotten much more complicated. And it has become sort of normal to find that customers don't know where their data resides in its entirety. And one of the values that gets brought with our product is helping get that sort of dynamic boundary around the data.
Okay. When we start thinking about data, that we need our security around the data, I 100% agree with that. But there is no operating system that provides that capability yet, or is there in a virtualized environment? I mean, everything seems to be system-based or blade-based.
Well, I think there's some interesting stuff going on with discovery of data, and some people put that in the DLP space, but I find myself trying to figure out where DLP resides, and it's an aspect of inventory management and configuration management, I think, to understand where your data resides and what types of data is, in which location.
Okay. Now, even when you start talking to customers about this, are they really concerned about protecting the data, or are they talking about protecting the systems?
Well, it's hard to find. Yeah, they're
data.
definitely concerned about the data, but with big data, it's interesting because this is a challenge that a lot of customers are having. And if all the data is of the same classification, then you can protect the application access and data and the data at the same time. But once you get into different use cases, how are you going to segment that big data if it's all in one big bubble?
Yeah, if you have a 28-node or 100-node Hadoop cluster,
right.
Your data could be anywhere on that cluster.
So you have a security team analyzing security data, and then a finance team analyzing finance data, and they're all using the same big data bubble. There's no controls inside that big data bubble at this point that I know of that can help segment that. You're kind of on the honor system, or you have to do a lot of good logging of activity and hope that nobody does anything. If they do, you can raise an alarm, but it's hard to prevent.
Mm-hmm.
So think about okay, go on, Rich.
Yeah, you raise an interesting point, and you were talking about logging and the use of logs. In point of fact, one of the things we're seeing is that as people start to make use of virtualization or finer-grained application mobility to move the processing to the data, very often they're using their logs as a way of kind of maintaining or providing some sort of in-service data quality approach. And that is, they're often using the process logs as a way of providing them with a kind of a provenance. This is, we can prove that we haven't moved the data, and here is everyone that's walked into the building and visited it. So
that's
there's
like a video camera of sorts, right?
It is. It's keeping track of everybody who's walked in the building and made use of a particular pile of data or class of data. And what this starts to look like is input into a different kind of data provenance, that is keeping records about the source of data, what's the right reference data to be using in a particular situation, and after the fact, keeping track of, just basically using it as a component of data quality. If this ever got to the point where one started doing real-time analysis of logs, you'd actually start to be looking at approaches to access control and probably finer-grained access to data, maybe as a way of addressing this very problem you just mentioned of walking into the large cluster and all be in one big bubble, where the honor system is what's now being used as the control.
When we start thinking about this, let's think about this one a little bit different. You're talking about big data centers. That's great. But let's say I have a Hadoop cluster, or let's just say I have some random number of VMs in Amazon's cloud, or I have effectively places where the logs are either unavailable or almost unintelligible. Where, if I'm in Amazon, I have absolutely no earthly idea where that data is. Could I possibly get that information from Amazon?
That's a good analogy, Ed. And I think if I hear what we're saying is the idea is that now a lot of your data is in the cloud. It used to be you would go to your laptop and process it, and you got hundreds of people now processing it from anywhere in the world. Well, why not move the applications into the cloud as well? So now you got both the applications and the data in the cloud. Well, how do you keep track of what's going on in there?
But again, I have application data. We're not talking security here. So when I start thinking about my application, my data in the cloud, and I start thinking about security, modern security says I secure that virtual machine that I'm creating in Amazon, for example. But if I'm just throwing my data up on S3, current thinking is we just encrypt it when we go to S3.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason being is that we don't have this S3 doesn't have this concept of a metadata about my data that gives you my security controls and policies.
Right.
And even if I did do that, could S3 interpret it? Ultimately, I want to protect the data, not the VM. I could care less about the operating system. I care about the data.
Yeah, and there are a few kind of added value approaches to kind of sitting on top of S3 or sitting on top of EBS that would arguably, at least the claim would be that everything is stored in an encrypted state, and the only way you get access to it is, through this conduit. I believe that Trend Micro has an implementation of, right, exactly, the secure cloud, for example. But I think you're pointing to two things, and that is securing it, but also you made the point, I don't know where my data really is. The level of granularity you now have for location may be only, it's in this region. And it begs the question as to whether multi-cloud or multi-infrastructure, multi-service tool sets actually start to present to applications information or the ability, when it's there, to identify specific location. And that might be geographic location, but it also might be something a little bit more difficult to address, and that is who's got custody, or who's got the right to govern the use of data. And in other words, what's the jurisdiction? It may not be just a matter of physical location. It may be a combination of physical location and jurisdiction. Who's been granted stewardship of the data, and what are their obligations and rights? Those are the kinds of things that all...
If we look at Amazon and a few other things like that, you're basically saying, they say they don't own it. They can control it. It's all up to you.
Right.
I doubt if you make use of Secure Cloud from Trend Micro, if Secure Cloud's going to take on the responsibility or onus of protecting your data. That's your responsibility. They just provide the tool. Now, that's
right.
U.S. law, and European law is completely different. The cloud provider is actually intimately involved in that particular protection process, depending on the type of data.
Mm-hmm.
But does the location of the data do we really care about it? I mean, here's the thing. I can wrap security
mm-hmm.
policy around my data. And whether that policy is it needs to be encrypted, or it cannot go to this particular country, or is only accessible by this particular set range of IP addresses, or any other type of access control. If I can wrap my data with a security policy, would it make a difference where it is? And if so, who does that now, as anybody? Because it seems like we're not protecting the data, we're protecting systems that possibly could access the data.
I think you're onto something right there, and that is and to some degree that's what I was referring to early on as kind of the genesis for a lot of these compliance rules, and they are specified in terms of physical location or something like physical location, maybe jurisdiction, but they're done on the basis of a computing model that's 15, 20, 30 years old. And these are rules that were often generated and regulations that were generated in a time where virtualization was something that was not common and was certainly nowhere near as prevalent as the basis on which you do production computing as you would today.
Okay.
So I think you're absolutely right. What it then begs, I think, is the question of, all right, is there some other distinction that's kind of like location that does have to be contained or dealt with? And I would say it's the concept of jurisdiction. Who legally has the right to say what you can't do, where it can and can not be used, or the concept of stewardship. What rights do you delegate to somebody else like an infrastructure provider? And what rights are they basically throwing up their hands and saying, not my job, your problem?
Well, that also brings up a question is why should I give, say there's stewardship, okay, that's great. There's no reason anybody outside of who I actually give rights to look at and read and write that data should ever be able to see that data.
Mm-hmm.
So even if I'm giving stewardship, those stewards should not be able to see the data unless they've actually been granted that right. And today, that's not the case. Unless you're actually encrypting it before you put it in the cloud, there's no, if you... And
to your point, not many people are doing that.
And there's not many people doing it, and when they do it, and I do it somehow my data has to be still intelligible to some of the software as a service platforms a la Salesforce. If I encrypt every little bit I put in there before I put it in, I can't actually even run the tools that they have in the program. So therefore, encrypted data in Salesforce is not going to happen.
But tokenized can and does.
Yes, exactly. The whole notion of data residency and dealing with something like Salesforce I won't say it's a big industry, but it's certainly being addressed by a number of companies, today, that I'm aware of. And the whole notion is, how do you obfuscate the data, and when it leaves the building and goes into Salesforce, it retains some qualities that you want to make use of while in Salesforce, but not available to the idle viewer. And once it returns to the premises of the owner, it gets reconstituted and is available to you in the clear.
I understand.
Let's take a second on this. All right, so let's just drill in. We know that irrespective of whether we can trust the system administrator at a cloud provider like a Salesforce, it's not just about that. It's the fact that this concentration of data in the cloud creates an opportunity for a malicious insider or outsider through the compromise of a single weak link to get access to all the data of all the tenants. Right? We've seen this in recent breaches where 150 million email addresses are lost, so to speak, by a single breach. And that's one of the areas where I'm more concerned about this type of issue. We see this, there was just some stuff posted around Facebook, because if you're a Facebook user, it has this feature where for all of your contacts, you can look up their phone numbers. And that's private to you, but what that really means is Facebook is now a huge phone book. And if there's a flaw in Facebook, then, everybody's phone number becomes public.
And there are no flaws in Facebook, right?
Oh, well, it's a web application. I'm sure there's many, many flaws. It's impossible for there not to be.
Well, that also is interesting, because I have for example, if my phone number ended up in Facebook, I'd be a little upset because I did not grant Facebook the right to do that.
Well, you did.
You did actually.
No, I didn't. I don't have a Facebook account. I don't put it in there. But the main thing is that if they did have it, I did not grant them access to it. It's not a registered number to start with.
But if I had I'm careful, right? I'm a data custodian for you. So I have your phone number, and if I had synced my phone book with Facebook, your phone number would now be in Facebook's database.
Yeah, and this has been done before, you guys. That's a good example. Facebook isn't the first to do this.
Oh, no.
I understand they're not the first to do it. If you look at programs like Jigsaw and everything, even Salesforce using Jigsaw does that. But when you start talking about this type of capability, I have not given Facebook the right to even have that. That is personal identifiable information. A phone number. It's used by a lot of people to do things. Facebook has no right to see my data nor to publish it, specifically if I said the phone number is unregistered to the phone company. Okay.
Right, but
so if they're doing that, they're in actually violation of several privacy laws.
No, they're not. Let's follow the causal chain here. If you give your phone number to a friend, and your friend syncs to Facebook, it's actually not Facebook that's potentially violated your privacy. It's your colleague or friend who has synced that data to Facebook.
Yeah, but Facebook storing in a master database and using it for everybody else is a custodian. Therefore, they have to live with the policies that I put in place.
I don't believe that's true. I don't believe that's true.
But I think that should be true. Because this is how. I mean, let's take a look at this one. This would be a very good way for someone who has been stalking you to get your number, and that is actually against the law. So therefore, Facebook now becomes even more of an area to avoid because of all the possibility of security breaches, personal, physical ones. They can get your address. They can get your phone number. They can get anything else about you. That would be a bad thing. Right?
Yeah. Again, we're once again kind of back in the whole notion of, what does custodianship or stewardship of data mean? And if in fact you present to a custodian or steward the information, what are your responsibilities with regard to walking in the door with it and placing it in that store, and what are their ongoing responsibilities? I mean, again, this starts to become a lot more about stewardship, ownership, rights, and access controls, and a whole lot less about physical location, which I think is, perfectly appropriate, and especially appropriate in an era where workloads are flying all over the place as a result of virtualization. So it is the right question. It just is, we're still, with one foot in the path that still requires us, for a number of reasons, some technical, some regulatory, to pay attention to location. And if it comes down to whether I have to pay fines for missing a compliance audit or not, those are the points in time when I'm going to spend money as a consumer to try to assure myself that I have managed the location of the data to the best of my ability, that in fact in some cases I move applications or application segments, and in some sense master the processing as opposed to master the data, so that I can maintain reasonable control, or at least visibility, over what process is making use of that data, which is the crown jewel.
Well, but now we're talking about intermediaries. So
Mm-hmm.
as I said, I gave some data to one of you guys. One of you guys gave some data to a third party that contained my data. No, that's not something I personally even have access to. I don't even know it happened. Right. So therefore, the data now is being transferred all around without the controls in place. So ultimately what we really want to do is put some policy around that data that says, sorry, it can't go anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And so the intermediaries they're not really necessarily doing anything wrong, but if I'm using, again, the Facebooks, the LinkedIns, and I don't publish my phone number normally, or I don't publish some piece of data, and it suddenly shows up there for the whole world to view, no, that is a case where LinkedIn, Facebook aren't actually being good custodians. Because it's not their data anyways, it's somebody else's. And they're trusting that somebody else did the right thing. Well, if there's intermediaries in the way, they don't even know who the somebody else is.
So, interesting analogy here. It seems like more and more the applications are needing to have the capability of protecting people's data. And if you think about the problem that YouTube has had with posting videos or songs that are infringing on copyright, they used to be able to just say, well, I didn't post it, it's our users that are posting it, so we're not responsible. Well, they're going to be ultimately the ones getting sued or having to do all this work to clean it up. So now they have automatic mechanisms in place to detect when there's a copyright infringement, and then that video could be blocked during its upload. So I would think that applications might have that same capability built into them. If it's a phone number being shared in Facebook or whatnot, you should have a way to detect that and warn you before that happens.
Or more to the point, maybe they should say, phone number associated with email address, mail the user and say, do you really want this to happen?
Some sort of verification scheme, right?
But not the actual person that put it, but the guy that owns the phone number and email address.
Yeah. By the way, did you know your phone number has been posted on these people's profiles?
Exactly.
Send you a text message or something.
Something like that would be useful, even if it's for people that actually aren't even signed into Facebook.
Or it could be maybe even a service that you run where you can say, I want to know everywhere my phone number is on all these social media websites, and I want to clean it up. I don't want my phone number up. So maybe it's
sounds like an opportunity for somebody.
If you make it a service, then that's an external service that we need access to the data, right?
So you have yet another company a footprint that could be attacked.
Right, and I think that it's a good point to point out the application needing to be more secure, because in some cases the data itself, when it's stored, say on storage or in the cloud, it's in a lot of cases randomized, so where you couldn't really go to one spot and say this is Edwards data right here. You have to have that interface in order to actually make sense of the data. So if it's not secure, then I think that's how people are going to be able to get your information, not from the lower levels in a lot of cases.
So,
does this imply the need or the role of a new kind of a data regime in which you never move the data or the authoritative version of the data, but only kind of metadata and references to it, and it's you're basically dealing with tokens like that in order to assert who's got control or who should have control, and the data provenance.
Well, there are some DLP solutions that do just that. They actually 360-something solutions, I think, or something similar to that. What they do, and some others do, is they give a link to the data. And then the link to the data requires you to have your secure ID or your either CAC card or something else, some other form of two-factor authentication before you can even access the data. But if you are on the road and don't have the capability to actually view that data because there's no network connection, you're basically out to lunch. It doesn't have a solution for that. So they do handle by passing around an address to the data, and then they redirect it through web browsers and so forth. So that is possible today. But if you think about, let's take a Hadoop cluster, for example. I have 100, maybe 1,000 nodes of Hadoop. Let's say it's the Hadoop that's in Amazon, right? I put up 28 gigs of data into my Hadoop cluster. What it then does is over those 1,000 nodes is take a chunk of that data and put it in each node, and then processes it and gets another chunk and so forth. so I do my reduction and get less data out, supposedly. In each of those cases, that data is being copied in clear text. And let's say it's financial data for whatever reason. That data is in clear text. How would I wrap a policy around that Hadoop cluster or around those bits of data so I actually am subsetting my data? So the policy has to be able to transfer down to those subsets and then be acted upon appropriately so that, A, the user, you're the one that issued the job, only your job's allowed to see it, and you. What do you think about that? I mean, is there anything that even has a solution for that?
Well,
now,
that's the point.
If the data was encrypted or scrambled in some way before you even put it in the Hadoop cluster, when it breaks it up, wouldn't it still not be readable?
No, because it can't work on encrypted data. Remember, it has to trying to reduce the data set. So encrypting
in the cluster, it has
reduced.
to be. Yeah, in the cluster, it has to be in the clear. I think the point there is you have to have a bastion that controls access to the Hadoop cluster.
Okay, so you're saying bastion to the Hadoop cluster instead of a policy around the data.
Well, because it's not sufficient to have a policy around the data. You have to have a policy and a bastion. And the bastion could be controlling the access and either tokenizing or encrypting the data going in and out of the cluster.
So
the trick there is not having a way. The hard part, right, is how do you control that access to the Hadoop cluster so it only goes through the bastion.
So that ends up that's a different approach, because what we were talking about is throwing a system in to say, okay, all access has to come through the system. And what I'm saying is that data itself should be able to determine what access is allowed to it, regardless of what is in front of it.
Well, you could do that by modifying the Hadoop application that's running in the cluster.
Well, you'd have to modify the file system really more than anything else to say, here's your policy around your data.
Right, but I think that's harder to do than to create a bastion, because economically a bastion that does this job would have applications that would be able to be used across multiple applications, not just Hadoop.
Well,
and so it's more likely to have somebody in the business of doing that than in the business of customizing Hadoop or the file system underneath.
Okay.
Right.
So,
and even if you had an encrypting file system underneath, which you could, if you're not controlling access to the cluster, then you run the risk of somebody impersonating, right? Or there's still other issues, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's think about that one a little bit more. Is there any tool that out there right now, does anybody know, that actually provides that policy around the data? That says whether or not who can access it, so that a bastion or some other node can read that policy and make their appropriate decisions.
Piece parts of it, and they tend to be specific to an application. For example, there are companies that are taking the approach for use with Salesforce to either tokenize or do other forms of obfuscation that allows the data to be searched for, processed, ordered correctly in its obfuscated form while in Salesforce, but return to kind of readability and human comprehensibility once it's off of Salesforce and back on premise. That's about as much as I know that's doing that, and those are companies like Perspexus and Navajo Systems, and I think there are at least one.
It is CipherCloud. They in fact
right.
have a Salesforce solution.
Right.
Yep.
So there are a couple folks that are taking that approach, and what you're talking about is not so much. They've basically put the the controls in the hands of the end user, the owner of the data, before it arrives into the multi-tenant service, the multi-tenant system. I don't know of anybody as a multi-tenant system provider that makes use of this kind of a obfuscation and protection, and has a full responsibility for both sides of that.
Okay.
Yeah, there's nobody who has some combination of identity and access management and PKI and encryption for their customers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there is one company that I know of. What they do is they consider the data to be the virtual machine. So what they do is they wrap the virtual machine with a policy, and then they use that virtual machine. That's Linux Secure. It's a new hypervisor, so they actually built into the hypervisor the ability to wrap VMs with some sort of policy.
Mm-hmm.
But outside of that, it's not, if your data is contained within that VM, that's great, but the operating system inside that VM may or may not have the same capability.
Right.
Right. The best we get to is possibly access control lists inside of Linux or SE Linux, where you can wrap some sort of policy around an object.
Right, but even that won't protect you, if you're running a web application with a SQL injection flaw, right? It's just...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because the web app has already been given access to modify the database.
Exactly.
So that now we're talking about, okay, so not only do we need the ability to do that, it would be nice if SE Linux was built kind of into virtualization at some layer, which I think would be really cool, or something like that, so that I can wrap policy around virtual machines. I can wrap policy around data stores, and if they don't match, forget it, you can't access it. But once I get inside the guest, now we have different issues at hand, right? Because it's been granted the access.
Right.
So that's where now we start talking about secure coding principles to make sure that you don't have any SQL injections. You've tested them. And that gets back to the whole question of DevOps and agile development, where people are developing way too fast, so they put out and says, oh, I tested it because it displayed right, instead of actually looking at the end result of the data to say, oh, the data has a flaw in it, but displays right.
Well, no. That's a flawed agile development process, because we run agile at Catbird, and you can build your sort of security validation tests into the build environment, so that you're unit testing as you build for secure coding practices.
Okay.
I'm not saying everybody does that, but I'm just saying there's no reason why you can't.
I would agree with that. There's no reason why you can't, but how many companies really do? A lot of secure coding principles are basically do a code review, look at it, find out there's a flaw by having another set of eyes look at it at the very least, right?
Right. The problem is that a lot of the security teams and organizations that are doing DevOps have not taken the same approach, so they're not as agile as the developers.
Exactly.
They expect a ticket to be opened and a project to be scheduled for review and whatnot. And, so the security needs to be adapted to be more agile as well in order to keep up DevOps.
That's exactly right.
So we're looking at asking for VMware and Zen and Citrix and Microsoft to implement some sort of object control inside of their hypervisors. I think that would actually help a lot.
Well, that would help, but you also need that at the application layer. So I also see things like Spring and other application tools. That's also a great place for this type of security requirement, especially in terms of data management, right?
So at the pass layer, we would want this type of
I think that's a huge competitive advantage, right, if it's at either at the software as a service or platform as a service layers. Because if Salesforce just transparently did this, so whether it's CipherCloud or some other solution, if
wouldn't make a difference.
It would or would not?
If Salesforce just did this, when you say this, just implemented it on the as a with the hypervisors.
No. If I, as a customer, had if part of my Salesforce service was data tokenization, right? Because it would have to be tokenization and not encryption in the case of Salesforce. So if my service for Salesforce, if my $50 a month or whatever it is they charge me included secure tokenization of the data, and then my Salesforce client on my PC or laptop and my Salesforce app on my phone was integrated with that tokenization, then I would always have access to the data. I would be able to manipulate the data, but a compromise on the Salesforce end, either by an insider or an outsider, would not breach the data.
Right.
And
I think
that would make me, I'd be very happy with that at that point. What?
Right, but you'd probably run into a religious issue with Salesforce that basically argues that you should be able to make use of their services no matter what, because they're not real. They don't seem to be particularly interested in delivering that kind of function out to the edge, like to your browser or to some other application that's feeding into Salesforce by means of an API. I mean, they consider their security, and you trust them.
No, I consider my data, and I don't trust anybody.
Well,
right.
That's why I think that. Yeah, no, I think that. I didn't say it was a correct attitude. I just said that there's a little bit of religiosity there that you're going to encounter. But I think you're absolutely right. There is a responsibility, and there's a division of responsibility for aspects of this that will end up protecting all of us with data that we hand over to others for some form of stewardship. And I think you've basically characterized the highest order piece of it. One of the others, I think, is the notion of when data remains, I'll call it static, and that is access to the data always has to go through, some logical kind of entry point that is controlled. That's the point where processing use of the data has to be not just vetted, but recorded, logged, if you want to think of it that way, for purposes of, post facto analysis. Because without that, you don't know what has happened and when and by whom.
Okay. So we have some capabilities today. Don't have a lot of capabilities today. What's the direction we want the companies to go into, the Salesforces of the world, the Amazons of the world, and all the hypervisor vendors, including the platforms as a service?
Well, for the cloud, I want a service level agreement or a set of service level agreements. I've been thinking about this for the last couple of weeks, actually. You know how there's all these different Creative Commons licenses? If you want to share something with the world, but you want to reserve some rights, there's, 10 different types of Creative Commons licenses for you to choose from to get what you want. We need that for the cloud, but we need it around, security and performance SLAs, because consumers, subscribers basically, don't know enough, and it's too hard to educate them well enough to write their own SLA. And what we should do, I think, as a community is maybe put our heads together and come up with the 10 cloud, SLA templates, right? If your data is PII, this is the SLA for you, right? And just kind of break it down, because frankly, it's hard enough for me to figure out what that is. And I actually don't know that I could, but I think a group of us could put that together.
Okay.
That's an interesting idea.
Very interesting.
Yeah, there's enough frameworks out there that the customers, although they are ultimately responsible for complying with the framework or compliance of any type of regulation, they don't know how to do that necessarily or how to adapt the technology to do that. So as we move into a cloud, you're actually paying someone else to do that for you. So we could, as cloud providers, we could offer suggested frameworks or show how other customers might have done it, sort of case studies and white papers. That can be built into the system. You just fill in the blanks.
Okay. So
the tools aren't there right now.
All right. So Rich, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I like the idea of establishing some clear, nicely bucketed sets of rights and responsibilities, which as long as they are auditable or capable of being recorded, it makes for the possibility of looking, in an objective fashion on both the situation where I have moved data to processing, or where, in fact, as we've talked about today as the subject, where I've moved processing to the data. There are a couple of issues then that get raised by that, and that is kind of your assurance of correct logging, and it's kind of the inspector that comes around and makes sure that the weights and measures group comes through and makes sure that you're in fact capturing this data. I wonder how that would work in a dynamic distributed cache environment, but I'll leave that for someone with more technical chops than I have to solve it. But I like the idea, and I like the notion of this being taken through as an approach that's independent of location, that is built on the back of stewardship and responsibility, and that you have a well-defined set of objective measures.
Okay. So we have something was brought up is that the link and ad picture stuff. Ad pic stuff is a default for everyone on LinkedIn.
I'm sorry.
Go on to that. Explain that, Michael, a little bit. It's similar to this, what we were talking
about.
Yeah,
I don't know if I know everything about it. I was just asking the caller, so to speak, to clarify. But I think what I heard, and I haven't looked into it, is that they're doing something with your profile picture connected to ads on LinkedIn. I guess if it's something you're using, or
it is. It's kind of everybody's linked into you.
Well, but I don't know if the advertisements are just limited to your connections. I think that's the point, is that it could pop up in somebody else's LinkedIn window, someone who isn't even a connection of yours, and the ad pops up with, Michael Berman is using TripIt, and then the picture of Michael Berman is there, part of the ad.
Oh, that's just so wrong, but that's the point. So when we start talking about something like that, it's almost like I need more controls inside of those applications to say, hey, I just don't want stuff like that to happen.
Well, luckily I lied to LinkedIn and I didn't put my real photo up, but.
Well, that's because you break the cameras.
That's right.
Yeah, there is no real photo
I'm not
of you.
visible on photos, right? It's like
yeah,
I can't see my reflection in the mirror either.
So, when we start thinking about that, I start thinking about just any type of cloud service, whether it's LinkedIn, Facebook, Salesforce, Google Apps, Google Docs, they have access to so much data. That type of privacy issue, I need to be able to authorize one way or the other. I still think that my data needs to be wrapped with some sort of policy that I can set. And then you start thinking about how Hadoop works and how big data things work, like Greenplum and Hadoop, where they move data around based on how big it is and how many nodes you have to distribute it over to get the performance. Or I start thinking about other cloud services where I actually have data in my VMs and I'm moving my VMs around from my enterprise to my infrastructure as a service through my hybrid cloud. That still is an issue. It's like, where do you ultimately put the control? Anybody have thoughts on that?
Well, the controls are moving from near the data to closer to the application. So as you move to a cloud model, you don't know the application. The vendors have to do that more.
Okay.
And that's the challenge right now.
You're saying the security is moving closer to the app.
Without the security being integrated in the app, if you want to move the data to be near the app, you can't do it for sensitive applications. That's been one of the barriers to virtualization or cloud adoption.
Why not move the security to the data?
You don't own...
And then it becomes part of the operating system.
So if you own the app, then you can control access to the data through the app, even if the data is not in a place where you can control it. Say it's in a cloud.
Okay.
You have a simple type of service account which allows access to the data, but you don't know who's actually accessing without tracking that from the application side. If each user has their own application to access their own user ID and authentication to access the data, then you can track that by getting logs after the fact from the service provider.
Okay.
But as we move the application out there, now it becomes more challenging if the application doesn't have those controls built into it.
So, Michael, what are your thoughts on this?
Sir, I've been updating my LinkedIn settings.
Right on. Let's all take a moment and do that.
It's actually pretty well hidden. I apologize. Ask the question again, please.
What do you think about where to put the data? Closer to the app or closer to the data? Put the security.
Oh, the data, the security should be as close to data as possible, which means it probably has to be in multiple places because data flows through applications, it's client server. But our model is to put the security as close to the data as possible.
Okay. Rich, what's your thoughts?
I would have to agree with Michael. There is the notion of securing your assets and protecting the valuable property is really a matter of placing that security and access close to its access and keeping tabs on its use. I don't think you can kind of aggregate responsibility altogether and not incorporate some pretty interesting and valuable security in the applications and with the operating system, as we were talking about earlier about the kind of adding certain aspects of security to the hypervisor. But ultimately, if you don't have it right there and as close as possible and as tightly linked to the data as you can make it, you've basically left the wide gaping holes through which security breaches happen.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Gentlemen, this is episode 66 of the Virtualization Security Podcast. I'd like to thank our special guest panelist, Rich Miller. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.